"We already started without you, Diana," my father said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the upscale dining room like a dull blade. He didn't look up from his plate. Instead, he systematically sliced into a thick, glistening cut of Wagyu steak, his fork scraping against the fine porcelain. "And before you even sit down, let's get one thing straight. You're picking up the tab tonight. It's the absolute least you can do for this family after the stunt you pulled 3 years ago." He spoke with an effortless authority, the kind of absolute certainty meant to freeze a person right in their tracks. Around him sat 16 members of my extended family, their eyes locked onto me, waiting for my reaction. The air in the private dining alcove of the Belvedere instantly grew heavy, thick with the scent of melted garlic butter, expensive charred beef, and the unspoken expectation of my compliance. On the white linen cloth before them lay out an absolute feast. Massive silver platters stacked with cracked lobster tails on mountains of shaved ice. Tiered stands overflowing with gourmet appetizers. And right in the center stood 3 empty bottles of a 2016 St. Gerard Bordeaux. A vintage I knew from my own inventory spreadsheets retailed for exactly $400 a bottle. They hadn't just ordered dinner. They had ordered an execution of my finances, and they had started pouring the wine before my car had even cleared the highway exit ramp. My father finally raised his eyes, a tight, manufactured smile spreading across his face. He truly believed he had cornered me. He believed that the sheer weight of public embarrassment, combined with the presence of aunts, uncles, and cousins, would force me to bow my head, open my purse, and play the role of the submissive, guilt-ridden daughter once again. What he hadn't counted on, however, were 2 distinct things. First, the precise, quiet sentence I was about to whisper to our 19-year-old waiter exactly 3 minutes from now. Second, the devastating truth that his own credit card was about to broadcast to every single person sitting at that table before the first round of espresso could even be served. But to understand how I found myself standing at the edge of that alcove, staring down 16 people who shared my DNA but none of my respect, we have to look back at the weeks leading up to this dinner. We have to look at the version of me they thought they were dealing with, and the version I had spent 3 painful, silent years learning how to leave behind. I don't own a restaurant group. I manage operations for one. There is a massive fundamental difference between the two, though my family could never seem to grasp it. To them, working in the corporate hospitality sector meant I sat on a throne of endless cash. The reality is far more clinical. I oversee 4 separate high-volume locations that collectively seat over 3,000 guests a week. My life runs entirely on razor-thin margins, supply chain contracts, labor cost percentages, and strict kitchen pars. I know how a guest check moves from the initial POS entry to the final credit card swipe the way most people know the layout of their own living rooms. I am 32 years old. I live in a modest 2-bedroom condominium that I managed to pay off early through sheer discipline. I drive a 9-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door, and my retirement account is something I monitor with obsessive, quiet regularity. I have exactly one luxury when I dine out. I order premium sparkling water. Still or sparkling, that is my single, unshakable ritual. My managers think it's just a quirky habit of a career restaurant director. It isn't. When you grow up in a household where your income is treated as communal property, you learn to keep your own personal tab small enough that you can drop cash on the table and walk away the moment things turn ugly. It was a standard Tuesday morning when the silence shattered. I was sitting in my main office, carefully reviewing a regional vendor contract for cold-pressed Mediterranean olive oil. It was the kind of mundane, numbers-driven morning that makes you forget the chaotic emotional instability of the world outside your spreadsheets. Suddenly, my phone buzzed against the darkwood desk. I glanced down and a physical chill instantly settled right behind my ribs. There, blinking on the screen, was a notification from a group text message chain. It wasn't just any group. It was the specific family chat I had been unceremoniously scrubbed from exactly 36 months prior, the very day I was branded the ultimate villain of the Mayfield family. The icon was a tiny, faded red heart emoji my mother had selected years ago when the chat was used exclusively for sharing holiday recipes and pictures of my sister Brooke's golden retriever. I sat completely still, staring at that little red heart for a full, uninterrupted minute before my thumb finally hovered over the glass to open it. The historical log of the chat was entirely pristine. There were absolutely no messages visible prior to the one my mother had just typed, which meant one of 2 things. Either they had all meticulously wiped the chat history before re-inviting me, or far more likely, they had been operating a secondary group chat without me for the last 3 years, keeping this original one on life support just in case they ever needed to pull the emergency brake. My mother's text was perfectly crafted. It was warm, deeply sentimental, and read as if it had been drafted and revised multiple times before hitting send. Diana, sweetheart. Your father and I have been doing so much deep reflection over the past few months. We miss you terribly, and we want nothing more than to start the process of healing as a family. Let's put the past behind us. We would love to invite you to a quiet dinner at the Belvedere this Thursday night. Just the 4 of us, you, me, your father, and Brooke. A fresh start for all of us. Then, exactly 30 seconds later, a secondary bubble appeared beneath it with the line that should have given the entire game away. Family always takes care of family, honey. It's time we finally remembered that. I leaned back in my office chair staring at those 5 specific words. Family takes care of family. My mind instantly flashed backward through a catalog of painful, expensive memories. My mother had whispered those exact words to me when I was 19 years old, standing in our kitchen, gently prying my envelope of server tips out of my hand because the electric bill was overdue. She had said it when I was 23, holding a pen out to me because my father needed a primary co-signer on a heavy-duty commercial truck he absolutely couldn't afford. She had muttered it when my younger sister Brooke's very first apartment lease fell through due to a broken credit check, prompting me to quietly transfer the entire security deposit out of my savings account to save her the embarrassment. In the Mayfield household, the phrase "family takes care of family" had never been a beautiful sentiment about mutual emotional support. It had always been a highly effective, weaponized piece of code that translated directly to, "Diana clears the balance." I analyzed the text message again. I noticed a distinct lack of accountability. My mother hadn't typed the word sorry. She hadn't admitted that they were wrong for cutting me off, nor did she acknowledge the 3 years of absolute frozen silence. She had simply used the passive voice, "Time to heal," as if the estrangement were a random weather event that had happened to all of us equally, rather than a deliberate choice they had made to punish me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of me, the rational part that managed multi-million-dollar restaurant budgets, told me to delete the app and block the numbers. But an older, deeply entrenched instinct flared up in my chest. I typed back 4 words, "I will be there." I set the phone face down on the desk, took a deep, shaky breath, and forced my eyes back to the olive oil contract, pretending with everything I had that my hands weren't trembling against the paperwork. To understand why the silence of those 3 years had been so deafening, you have to understand the exact nature of our fracturing. It happened because of a cafe. 3 years ago, my sister Brooke decided she wanted to become an entrepreneur. She didn't possess a formal business plan, she hadn't conducted a single demographic market analysis, and she had never managed so much as a high school lemonade stand. What she did have was a collection of saved Pinterest boards featuring a beautiful exposed brick cafe concept in Charleston, complete with a specialized matcha menu and custom linen aprons. She was 26 years old, brimming with unearned confidence, and she required a $75,000 small business loan to secure the lease. The local commercial bank agreed to fund the loan on one strict condition. She needed a well-qualified, financially stable co-signer. That co-signer was supposed to be me. I remember the Sunday afternoon my parents called me over to discuss it. My father was sitting on the living room sofa, his arms locked tightly across his chest, his jaw already set in an aggressive line before I had even crossed the threshold. Brooke needed the money. The cafe was her ultimate dream. I had an immaculate credit score, a highly predictable corporate income, and a long documented history of always saying yes to keep the peace. "Just sign the underwriting paperwork, Diana," my father had ordered, tossing the thick packet of bank documents onto the coffee table. "Don't overthink it. She's your sister." "I need to see the projected numbers first," I replied quietly, refusing to touch the pen. "I want to see the lease terms, the food cost calculations, the supplier contracts, and the break-even analysis." Brooke had openly glared at me from the kitchen island, looking at me as if I had personally insulted her integrity. My mother's face instantly drained of all its artificial warmth, her voice dropping into a flat, icy register. "She is your younger sister, Diana. You don't require a spreadsheet to show love to your own flesh and blood." "I am saying no," I said, my voice steady despite the absolute terror pounding in my veins. I didn't say no because I wanted Brooke to fail. I loved her. But I had spent my entire adult life working within the brutal reality of the food and beverage industry. I had watched dozens of well-meaning, overly optimistic people pour their life savings, their inheritances, and their families' futures into beautiful culinary concepts that had absolutely no structural foundation. I knew exactly what $75,000 of high-interest commercial debt looked like at 3 o'clock in the morning when the dining room is pitch black, the foot traffic is non-existent, and the bank payment is still systematically pulled from your account regardless of your dreams. My father stood up so fast his joints popped. He marched over to the front door, threw it wide open, and pointed out into the dark driveway. He said the exact words that would effectively seal that door shut for the next 3 years. If you refuse to support this family when it counts, then you are no longer a part of it. Get out of my house. I drove back to my condo in total silence. The very next morning, I woke up to find I had been systematically removed from the family group chat, blocked on social media, and entirely erased from Sunday dinners. No one called. No one sent a text on my birthday. For 1,000 days, the narrative within the Mayfield family circle was completely solidified. Diana was the cold, unfeeling, money-obsessed daughter who valued her bank balance more than her sister's happiness. And here is the absolute hardest part for me to admit out loud. That 3-year silence almost completely broke me. It didn't break me because I thought they were right. Deep down, I knew with absolute operational certainty that my refusal was the correct decision. It broke me because I suddenly realized how deeply addicted I was to the feeling of being needed. It is a terrifying, insidious kind of psychological wound, one that took me 2 full years of intensive therapy with a brilliant counselor named Dr. Kwan to properly identify and name. I had been molded into the family fixer since the moment I turned 17. My very first minimum wage paycheck from a local Knoxville steakhouse went directly toward buying household groceries. My first substantial corporate tax refund was handed over to cover my mother's extensive root canal work. When the transmission completely dropped out of my father's old pickup truck, I quietly paid the $4,000 mechanic bill in full, instructing the shop manager to tell my father it was entirely covered under a retroactive factory warranty because I knew his intense masculine pride would never allow him to accept a direct financial handout from his 22-year-old daughter. When Brooke got married, I quietly funded the florist, the professional photographer, and nearly half of the catering deposit. I remember standing at the back of the reception hall, smiling tightly while my mother stood up to give a beautiful, tearful toast about the immense pride she felt in raising 2 incredibly strong, independent girls. 2 strong girls. 1 single hidden bill. I hadn't acted out of pure, unadulterated generosity. I did it because I had subconsciously learned around the age of 15 that the absolute fastest, most efficient way to maintain emotional peace in my household was to ensure that nobody ever had to ask for anything twice. If someone asked once, Diana paid the invoice, everyone smiled, and the dinner table remained perfectly quiet. I had systematically trained them. I had taught my own parents that my personal bank account was nothing more than a reliable vending machine. Insert a sufficient amount of familial guilt, press the button, and receive a cleared check. And when the machine finally flashed an out-of-order sign during Brooke's cafe crisis, they didn't bother to troubleshoot the problem. They simply yanked the cord out of the wall and walked away to find a better option. So when my mother's text message appeared on my screen after 3 years of total isolation, invoking those same dangerous words, "Family takes care of family, sweetheart," I felt the old, deeply hardwired reflex spark to life in my chest like an old muscle that hadn't been stretched in years. "Go fix it," the voice whispered. "Just pay whatever the number is. Make the screaming stop. Make them love you again." But beneath that ancient reflex, I also heard Dr. Kwan's voice, perfectly measured, steady as a metronome. "Diana, you spent years teaching them that your boundaries had a dollar amount. That was your mistake to correct. You don't correct it by funding them further. You correct it by standing completely still." My operations manager, Jess, begged me not to attend. We were sitting across from each other at lunch the day after the invitation arrived, and she looked at me with deep concern. "Diana, look at the logistics," Jess said, setting her fork down. "A sudden invitation after 3 years to an incredibly expensive restaurant? This has a calculated ambush written all over it." I remember letting out a dry, hollow laugh. Jess had never spent a single second in the same room as my parents, yet she could read the structural warning signs of my family dynamic with far more clarity than I could. My executive sous chef Marco shook his head when I told him, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. Chef's warning, boss. Don't walk into a kitchen where you don't know who controls the gas lines. Don't go. But my mind was completely made up. I wasn't going because I suddenly believed my parents had experienced a profound moral awakening. I wasn't expecting a tearful, deeply felt apology on the steps of the restaurant. I wanted to sit directly across from them and find out once and for all whether 3 years of total separation had changed a single variable in their equations, or if the silence had just been a longer, more agonizing extension of the exact same conversation we had been having our entire lives. A conversation where my sole purpose was to listen, agree, and underwrite the cost of their choices. I desperately wanted closure, even if that closure meant watching them nail the door shut right in front of my face. And there was another truth too, one I have to be completely honest about because I think anyone who has ever been estranged from their family will recognize the ache. I deeply missed my mother. Not the mother who calculated seating arrangements or kept a running score of perceived slights. I missed the mother who had stood beside me when I was 9 years old, teaching me how to properly season a cast iron skillet to make perfect southern cornbread, singing at the top of her lungs along with an old Dolly Parton cassette tape while the butter melted in the pan. That specific mother hadn't called me in 3 years either. But on the long, quiet nights in my condo, I could still hear the faint, distant echo of that Dolly Parton song playing in the back of my mind. So I told Jess I would be perfectly fine. I told Marco I could handle the heat. I told myself the exact same lie until I almost believed it. I established one unshakable foundational rule for the evening. One single dinner, completely civil, absolutely zero discussion of personal finances. And if the air turned sour for even a second, I would leave before the dessert menus were printed. I wrote those exact words. One dinner, then home, on a small pink sticky note and pressed it firmly onto the center of my steering wheel the morning of the dinner. That little slip of paper was still staring back at me when I finally pulled into the heavily landscaped parking lot of the Belvedere on Thursday night and began to count the vehicles. I intentionally dressed down for the occasion. I chose a pair of simple black tailored slacks, a muted gray silk blouse I typically wear to regional vendor negotiations, flat leather shoes, and absolutely zero jewelry save for a modest silver wristwatch I had purchased for myself the exact week I was promoted to regional operations director. I didn't wear it to flaunt anything. I wore it because I had earned every single dollar of its cost through 80-hour workweeks. It kept flawless time, and it felt like a small anchor of reality. I didn't want to walk into that dining room looking like I was performing a character of success. My family already harbored a deep, bitter resentment toward my career, firmly believing I constantly rubbed my achievements in their faces. The reality was far more mundane. I drove a 9-year-old car and spent my Sunday afternoons meal prepping Tupperware containers of chicken and rice like half of working America. The drive to the upscale side of town took exactly 40 minutes. I kept the radio turned off the entire way, my hands locked firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the wheel. Somewhere around the highway merge, my stomach began to tighten and twist in a horribly familiar pattern. It was the exact internal physical sensation I get on a chaotic Friday night when a massive walk-in cooler suddenly loses power right at the start of the dinner rush, and your entire body internalizes the immediate realization that the next 6 hours are going to be absolute hell. It was pure survival instinct. My body recognized the incoming trauma long before my rational brain was done negotiating with the potential outcome. I actually slowed down at the final exit ramp, my foot hovering over the brake pedal, intensely tempted to turn the car around, drive back to my safe, quiet condo and eat leftover soup in the dark. But I thought about that cast iron cornbread. I thought about Dr. Kwan's steady voice. I took a deep breath, released the brake and kept driving. The Belvedere was situated at the cul-de-sac of an elite commercial strip I hadn't visited in years. It was the kind of high-end establishment where the parking spaces are framed by manicured boxwood hedges and the hostesses are required to wear identical, tailored black cocktail dresses. I pulled into the lot and my eyes immediately locked onto the third row. There was my father's pickup truck. The same old Ford from 5 years ago, still sporting the deep rusting dent in the rear quarter panel he had never bothered to fix. Right next to it was my mother's sedan. Fine, I thought. Just like the text said. But then my gaze drifted to the left. There was Aunt Linda's unmistakable white Buick. Next to that was Uncle Greg's massive black SUV. And parked right beside the curb was Brooke's dented little hatchback, still bearing a faded, peeling bumper sticker from the custom cafe concept that had gone completely bankrupt exactly 11 months after she opened it. I scanned the rest of the row. 3 more vehicles belonged to various cousins. 2 were cars I didn't even recognize. My stomach didn't just drop. It completely bottomed out. Just the 4 of us, my mother had explicitly typed. I counted 9 vehicles belonging to the Mayfield inner circle. I sat in my idling car for 2 full minutes, the engine humming quietly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. I stared directly at the pink sticky note. 1 dinner then home. The intelligent, self-protective choice would have been to shift the car into reverse, back out of the lot, drive 40 minutes back to my side of town, and completely block every single one of their numbers for the rest of my life. I could have avoided the impending storm entirely, but instead I turned off the ignition. I smoothed down the front of my gray blouse, grabbed my purse, locked the door, and walked directly toward the heavy glass entrance. I was 32 years old. I had spent 3 grueling years rebuilding my sense of self-worth from scratch, and I was absolutely refused to start running away from my own shadow in a restaurant parking lot on a Thursday night. The main entrance doors were massive panels of heavy tempered glass fitted with polished brass handles. The kind of architectural detail that whispers entrees start at $42 before you can even catch a glimpse of a physical menu. Inside, the foyer smelled intensely of fresh rosemary, wood-fired bread, and old, established money. A young hostess standing behind a sleek marble podium offered me a professional, practiced smile as she consulted her iPad screen. "Name for the reservation, Mocklock?" "Mayfield," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. The hostess's expression shifted instantly. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch of the eyes, the exact look high-volume hostesses get when they have been forced to manage a chaotic, demanding large party for over an hour and are using every ounce of their remaining energy not to appear visibly cracked. I recognized that specific micro-expression instantly. I had worn it on my own face 1,000 times across 15 years of restaurant management. She picked up a single leather-bound menu, just one, and turned back to me. "Your party is already seated in the private alcove, ma'am. Right this way." I could hear them long before we even approached the threshold of the dining area. Loud, booming laughter, the distinct, aggressive clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses, and Aunt Linda's unmistakable sharp cackle cutting straight through the elegant, muted murmur of every other table in the room. "One dinner, then home," I reminded myself like a mantra. We rounded the corner and the full scope of the ambush was finally laid bare. 16 chairs. Every single seat was occupied except for the one situated at the very far end of the long table, positioned directly across from my father, who sat like a king at the head. The table occupied the entire length of the private architectural alcove. It was dressed in heavy white linen, set with polished silver, and illuminated by flickering low-profile candles. There were massive family-style platters scattered down the entire length of the table, culinary layouts I could identify and price out from 10 feet away with my eyes half closed. Chilled seafood towers overflowing with split lobster tails, tiered slate platters stacked with Wagyu beef sliders, artisanal charcuterie boards the size of coffee tables, and right in the center stood 3 distinct bottles of a 2016 St. Gerard Bordeaux. It was a vintage I knew well from regional distributor tastings. It retailed for roughly $400 a bottle, and 2 of them were already completely empty. They hadn't just arrived. They had been here for a significant amount of time, and they were ordering with a complete disregard for the constraints of reality. The young hostess came to a halt at the edge of the alcove, glancing back at me with a look of pure, unadulterated sympathy that required absolutely no translation. "Good luck," her eyes said. She leaned in slightly closer to me and whispered under her breath, "Your father placed a credit card down on file earlier this afternoon to secure the private space. We require a hold for any parties exceeding 12 guests. Just so you are aware." I filed that operational detail away in my mind the exact same way I file away inventory variances. Silently, completely, and permanently. His card was physically on file with the house. He had legally secured the reservation. And yet, looking at the smug expression on his face as he watched me approach, I already knew with absolute certainty that the final bill was never intended to hit his statement. My mother was the first to spot me. She stood up from her chair, her arms flung wide open in a theatrical display of maternal affection, causing every single head at the long table to swing around in unison. Diana. Oh, look at you, sweetheart. Then came the applause. Actual, synchronized applause broke out around the table, as if I were a decorated soldier returning home from a hazardous foreign deployment, rather than the daughter they had completely ghosted and ignored for over 1,000 days. Uncle Greg let out a loud, piercing whistle. Aunt Linda dramatically dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a cloth napkin. Brooke slowly raised her half-empty wine glass, a tight smile spreading across her lips. The kind of smile that shows a lot of polished white teeth but absolutely zero emotional warmth. 16 people. Lobster towers, Wagyu sliders, $400 bottles of Bordeaux. Just the 4 of us, my mother had written. I walked over and sat down in the vacant chair. What else can you realistically do when 16 pairs of eyes are tracking your every movement? The heavy oak chair has already been pulled out for you, and a back waiter is already actively pouring ice water into your glass before your purse has even touched the floor. I sat down and I put a calm, pleasant smile on my face, because that is exactly what 15 years of high-level hospitality training teaches you. The ability to smile flawlessly while your brain is executing a high-speed internal threat assessment. My mother settled back into her seat, her face beaming with artificial triumph. We wanted it to be a wonderful surprise for you, Diana. The entire family gathered together under one roof, just like the old days. I was under the distinct impression it was just the 4 of us, Mom, I said, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of inflection. Mom waved her hand dismissively through the air, as if swatting away an annoying fly. Oh well, once Linda found out we were reconnecting, she just insisted on coming, and then Greg heard, and then your cousin Tara. It just grew organically, sweetheart. You know how family is. I knew exactly how family was. I slowly scanned the layout of the table, performing a cold calculation. My father sat at the absolute apex, carving a Wagyu slider with his knife as if he were a patriarch presiding over a Thanksgiving turkey. Brooke sat directly to his left, her phone held in one hand under the edge of the table, her wine glass in the other, her eyes mindlessly scrolling through something on her screen. Aunt Linda and Uncle Greg anchored the middle section of the table. Cousins I hadn't spoken a single word to since a tense holiday gathering 5 years ago filled out the remaining seats. Tyler, Megan, Jake, 2 wives whose names I could barely recall, and an elderly woman who turned out to be Aunt Linda's next-door neighbor. Someone I had never seen before in my entire life, but who was currently happily cracking open a premium lobster tail on whatever occasion this was supposed to be. The wine was flowing effortlessly. The shared platters were already half demolished. They had clearly been seated for at least an hour before my mandated arrival time, and they had gone out of their way to order every single high-margin item on the menu that didn't require a background check to purchase. Mom leaned across the corner of the linen cloth, her fingers reaching out to tightly squeeze my hand. See? Family always takes care of family, Diana. There they were again. Those exact 5 words, delivered with the same warm, sentimental packaging, aimed directly at the exact same target. I squeezed her hand back gently, offered a pleasant nod, and said absolutely nothing. I was too busy counting the plates. My father is the specific type of man who doesn't ask a table what they want. He orders for them. He caught the eye of our primary waiter, a young guy who looked barely out of his teens, operating entirely on pure adrenaline and visible anxiety, and snapped his fingers, rattling off a series of heavy additions without bothering to glance at the menu. Hey buddy, let's get another round of those cold lobster tails down here, 2 more of the Wagyu platters, and bring us another bottle of that Bordeaux. The Saint Rod, the good stuff, he commanded, his voice boisterous, intentionally loud enough for the tables on either side of our alcove to hear every word. Dad pulled his leather wallet from his back pocket, extracted a sleek credit card, and held it aloft between 2 fingers, flashily turning it back and forth like a stage magician demonstrating a coin to an audience before executing a sleight of hand. Put everything on this card for now, he instructed the waiter with a patronizing wink. We're celebrating a massive family homecoming tonight. The young waiter, whose name tag read Nathan, quickly scribbled the additions onto his notepad, nodded nervously, and disappeared back toward the kitchen corridor with the exhausted look of an employee who desperately needed a smoke break. I watched my father slide the card back into his wallet, giving the leather a self-satisfied little pat. It was the exact way you pat a dog that has successfully executed a trick on command. Something about the logistics felt incredibly wrong. I had grown up watching my father spend 45 minutes fiercely arguing with a mechanic over the marginal cost of a replacement muffler. I had seen him make my mother return a shirt to a department store because a $5 sale tag was missing. Raymond Mayfield did not casually order $400 bottles of imported wine. He did not wave premium credit cards around like flags at a parade. This entire evening was an elaborately staged performance, and it was being put on for an audience of exactly one, me. Look how incredibly well we're doing without you, Diana. Look how little we ever needed your money. Except for one glaring operational detail. The truck parked out in the third row was the exact same vehicle from 5 years ago, still boasting that deep, unrepaired dent in the bodywork. And my mother's handbag, a Coach purse she had carried since I was a sophomore in high school, sat on the empty chair right beside her, its leather strap visibly cracked and held together at the base by a large silver safety pin. They were performing a script of wealth. I just didn't know the exact price of admission yet. The microaggressions and small cuts began to surface around the opening of the fourth bottle of wine. Aunt Linda leaned across Uncle Greg's shoulder, her eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, glassy glint. It must be absolutely wonderful running all those incredibly fancy restaurants, Diana, while the rest of your family is stuck clipping coupons just to get by. She let out a sharp laugh right after saying it, the specific kind of artificial laugh people utilize when they want to deliver a cruel insult but retain the safety net of claiming it was just a joke. Cousin Megan chimed in next, setting her wine glass down with a soft click. Do you ever feel a twinge of guilt, Diana? Living so incredibly well in your paid-off condo while your own parents are going through such a horrific financial rough patch. I sat perfectly still. A financial rough patch? Nobody had uttered a single syllable to me about a rough patch. Brooke, without even bothering to look up from her glowing phone screen, added a cold, muttered postscript. She wouldn't know anything about it, Megan. She hasn't exactly been around. She chose to walk away, remember? Each individual comment landed with the calculated precision of a well-rehearsed theater cue. It wasn't that they had written out a formal script, but they were perfectly aligned the way a well-trained choir finds the exact same note without needing a conductor. They had been discussing me behind closed doors for months. They had dissected my absence, dissected my income, dissected my boundaries, and they had walked through the front doors of the Belvedere tonight with a completely unified narrative. Diana left us. Diana has an abundance of wealth. Diana owes this family everything. Aunt Linda finally delivered the core thesis of the ambush. She reached across the expanse of the white tablecloth, wrapping her fingers around my wrist like a grieving relative offering comfort at a funeral. Family doesn't keep a running score, dear. It's time to let it go. I had to use every single ounce of my corporate training to prevent myself from laughing out loud. Family doesn't keep score. This statement was coming from a woman who had famously refused to speak a single word to her own daughter-in-law for 6 months because of a perceived seating arrangement slight at a Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. I didn't let my expression crack. I smoothly slid my hand back out of her grasp, picked up my glass and took a slow sip. Sparkling water. The only item sitting directly in front of me. The only item I had personally authorized. The visual contrast of the table was almost comedic. 16 people completely drowning in expensive seafood platters and premium Bordeaux, and me sitting at the absolute terminus of the table with a single glass of sand-filtered water, looking exactly like a designated driver who had accidentally walked into a bachelor party. Nathan, our young waiter, slipped quietly behind my chair to clear an empty bread basket, and I managed to catch his eye. "Just the sparkling water for you tonight, ma'am?" he asked in a quiet, respectful undertone. "Just the water, Nathan." "Thank you," I replied. He offered a subtle, knowing nod, a look passing over his face that told me he understood the internal dynamics of this table far better than he let on. Let me tell you about Nathan. He was 19, maybe 20 years old at the absolute most, with that thin, wire-built frame that almost every restaurant kid develops before they learn how to properly feed themselves between the crushing geometry of back-to-back weekend shifts. He moved through the alcove with a frantic but incredibly careful speed, the exact frantic energy unique to green servers who realize the table they are managing is far too large, the orders are far too complex, and a single misplaced entree means an agonizing conversation with a floor manager they simply cannot afford to have. He was managing our 16 top entirely by himself. A boozer would materialize every 20 minutes to clear away empty lobster shells. but Nathan was personally running every single modification, every drink refill, and every demanding request for extra ramekins of melted butter from Aunt Linda, who had snapped her fingers at him 3 times in a 20-minute window. He never let his posture drop. He never let out a visible sigh. He kept my sparkling water glass topped off without me ever having to ask. And when he set the bottle down, he caught me observing the chaotic table with an expression of clinical exhaustion I really should have hidden better. "Long night," he murmured under his breath, adjusting his tray. I came incredibly close to telling him the absolute truth. Instead, I simply looked up at him and said, "You are doing an absolutely phenomenal job tonight, Nathan." He blinked twice, completely startled, as if he had entirely forgotten that a customer sitting at this table was capable of treating him like a human being. Then, his shoulders squared, he stood about half an inch taller, and he moved smoothly along to handle Uncle Greg's bourbon refill. I watched his back as he walked away, my mind flashing violently backward to the 17-year-old version of myself who used to carry 4 heavy plates of steak up her forearm until her muscles screamed, crying silently inside the walk-in freezer on the particularly brutal weekend shifts. That young girl had absolutely no conception that she would eventually end up on the exact opposite side of the hospitality matrix, sitting across from the very people who had forged her into a financial fixer, being asked without words to sign her name to one more blank check. But that young girl would have understood exactly what I was about to do next. She would have approved of it completely. At exactly the 45-minute mark of the dinner, I politely excused myself to the restroom. I didn't actually need to use the facilities. I desperately required 90 seconds of absolute silence away from Aunt Linda's passive-aggressive commentary and a solid door I could firmly lock behind me. The Belvedere's restroom was designed with a heavy emphasis on luxury, thick linen hand towels, imported lavender hand soaps, and a large gold-framed full-length mirror fitted with soft, incredibly flattering amber lighting that made you look significantly better than you actually felt. Which was an impressive architectural feat, considering that at that exact moment, I felt as though I were slowly digesting shards of broken glass. I stepped up to the marble vanity, turned on the polished brass faucet, and held my wrists directly under the stream of ice-cold water. An old operational trick I use when I need my resting heart rate to immediately cooperate with my logical brain. Then my eyes drifted down to the far edge of the marble countertop. There lay a smartphone, its screen brightly illuminated, its protective plastic case covered in distinctive pastel daisy stickers. It was Brooke's phone. She must have slipped into the restroom right before I did and left it sitting on the counter when she got distracted by her appearance. Brooke had a lifelong habit of leaving her expensive personal belongings scattered in public spaces. It was one of the incredibly few behavioral traits we actually shared. I had absolutely no intention of looking at her device. I want to be profoundly clear about that. My personal ethics do not include snooping through family members' private correspondence. But the screen was turned face up, set to maximum brightness, and a massive push notification banner hanging at the very top of the glass came from a private group chat I had never been added to. The preview text visible on the lock screen was more than enough to freeze my hand mid-reach for a linen towel. The group chat was titled in all capital letters, "Dinner Plan." There were exactly 3 members listed in the thread: Mom, Dad, and Brooke. The most recent message, time-stamped exactly 4 days ago, had been sent by my mother. The preview banner displayed a sequence of words that I can still recite flawlessly from memory right now. "Whatever you do, do not tell Diana that the entire family is coming. Once she is physically sitting there with the whole family watching her, she won't dare say no. She has never been able to handle a public scene." The message cut off right at the plastic edge of the phone case. My pulse remained completely steady. My hands were perfectly dry. I reached down and picked up Brooke's phone with the exact same clinical detachment I use when I pick up a vendor invoice that doesn't balance at the end of the fiscal month. I felt no sudden surge of hot anger. I felt no wave of tearful surprise. I was simply confirming a structural deficit that the numbers had already revealed to me. I used my thumb to scroll upward through the notification log. The complete, untruncated message from my mother read, "Whatever you do, do not tell Diana that the entire family is coming. Once she is physically sitting there with the whole family watching her, she won't dare say no. She has never been able to handle a public scene. We can force her to clear the table bill and bring up the bridge loan before dessert arrives." Beneath that, my father had replied with an immediate logistical confirmation. Just make absolutely sure she sits at my end of the table. I will handle the formal financial ask once the wine is open. Brooke's personal contribution to the strategy thread had been timestamped exactly 2 minutes later. Make sure you order all the incredibly expensive stuff before she even pulls into the lot. Once the food is physically on the table, she can't exactly send it back to the kitchen. Oh. I kept scrolling backward through the log. There were 3 solid weeks of meticulous logistical coordination. My mother had been systematically managing the RSVPs behind my back. Linda is confirmed. Greg is in. Megan says she'll definitely come if there's premium wine included. My father's texts were shorter, focusing almost entirely on the operational details. Parking availability, the exact reservation time, detailed discussions on how to carefully phrase the initial text invitation so it would sound entirely casual, loving, and non-threatening. And then I reached the messages that turned my stomach completely hollow. From Mom, sent exactly 10 days ago. The commercial bank called our house again on Thursday morning. We have to figure out a structural solution before the June foreclosure proceedings start on the property. From Dad. Diana's corporate salary can easily cover our arrears through the spring. She has more than enough liquidity sitting in her accounts. And the final message sent by my mother 8 days ago, hitting my chest like a heavy sack of gravel dropped from a high shelf. We aren't asking her for a handout. We are letting her back into this family. She should be profoundly grateful that we are even giving her this chance to make amends. Grateful. They sincerely believed I should feel deeply grateful for the immense privilege of being systematically deceived into a 16-person dinner at an upscale restaurant I would never have selected for myself, so that I could be publicly forced to underwrite a multi-thousand-dollar bill I hadn't ordered, all to solve a structural financial crisis they hadn't even had the basic decency to tell me about. A crisis engineered by the very people who had entirely cut me out of their lives the exact moment I dared to say no to them the last time. I carefully placed Brooke's phone back down onto the cold marble countertop, screen side down, positioning it exactly where she had left it. I turned back to the basin, thoroughly washed my hands with the lavender soap, and looked directly at my reflection in that beautiful, flattering mirror. I see exactly what you are doing, I thought, staring at my own calm eyes. I know precisely what this evening is supposed to cost me, and for the first time in 15 years, I am absolutely refused to pay the price. I stood on the tile floor of that restroom, holding the absolute truth of my family dynamic in both hands. And the strangest, most liberating part of the entire experience was how incredibly serene I felt. I wasn't numb and I wasn't blindingly angry. I was completely clear. It was the exact internal state a high-volume kitchen enters right before the absolute peak of a Saturday night dinner rush. Every single tool is in its proper position. Absolutely nothing is being wasted, and every station is primed for execution. If you have ever experienced that agonizing moment of realization where you discover that you are only loved by your family for what you can financially provide rather than for who you fundamentally are, then you know exactly how cold that bathroom floor felt beneath my shoes. But what happened next changed everything. I stepped out of that restroom and walked directly back into the dining room, a completely different plan already fully formed in my mind. I walked out of the restroom corridor, my eyes scanning the main floor of the dining room until I located Nathan. He was standing near the terminal, entering an order. I stepped up beside him, keeping my voice down to an absolute whisper. "Nathan," I said, catching his attention, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am the Regional Operations Director for the Bistro Group across town. I know exactly how your POS system works, and I know your house protocols for large parties." He froze, his fingers hovering over the touchscreen, his eyes widening slightly. "Yes, ma'am. In exactly 10 minutes, my father is going to ask you to bring the final itemized check for this entire table," I whispered, handing him a clean $50 bill from my pocket. "This tip is for you, completely separate from the table service. When he asks for that bill, I want you to split my single glass of sparkling water onto its own separate receipt. Bring my single water receipt directly to me, and hand the master bill for the other 16 guests directly to the gentleman sitting at the head of the table. His credit card is already physically holding the reservation on file. Do you understand me?" Nathan looked at the $50 bill, then looked back at my face. A slow, incredibly sharp expression of absolute comprehension washed over his features. He gave me a firm, professional nod. "I understand completely, chef. I'll split the ticket right now." "Thank you," I said, and I walked back to the alcove, sliding smoothly into my seat across from my father. The trap was fully set. The dinner was rapidly winding down to its structural conclusion. The massive seafood platters were nothing more than a graveyard of empty red shells and melted butter ramekins. The fourth bottle of St. Gerard Bordeaux had been drained down to the last drop. My father wiped his mouth thoroughly with his linen napkin, tossed it onto his empty plate, and cleared his throat loudly. The entire table instantly went dead silent, exactly as they had practiced in their text messages. 16 people turned their heads to watch the patriarch execute the final act. "Well, Diana," Dad began, leaning forward over the table, his voice dripping with an artificial, heavy paternal warmth. "It has been absolutely wonderful having you back where you belong tonight. Family truly is the most important thing in this world. And seeing as you're doing so incredibly well for yourself these days, running all these massive corporate operations, your mother and I knew you'd want to handle the dinner tonight as a sign of good faith. A way to show the family that you're truly committed to being a part of us again." He smiled warmly, gesturing around the table at the absolute devastation of food and wine. "It comes out to roughly $4,000 with the premium alcohol. A drop in the bucket for someone with your salary, right? And while we're on the subject, your mother and I have a small real estate bridge loan contract we need you to look over before we head home." The entire alcove was completely silent. I could feel the intense, suffocating weight of 16 people staring directly at my face, waiting for the familiar sight of my compliance. They were waiting for me to blush, look down at my lap, sigh in resignation, and reach into my purse to clear their choices. Brooke was watching me with a smug, mocking little grin. My mother was nodding encouragingly, her hands clasped tightly under her chin. I didn't blink. I didn't reach for my purse. I simply looked my father dead in the eye, my face completely expressionless. "No," I said. The word was incredibly quiet, yet it carried the precise physical impact of a sudden pane of glass shattering across the white linen tablecloth. My father's artificial smile instantly froze in place, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What did you just say?" "I said no, Dad," I repeated, my voice completely calm, steady, and entirely devoid of fear. "I am not paying for this dinner. And I am absolutely not signing a single line of a real estate bridge loan." "Diana," my mother gasped, her hand flying straight to her throat, her voice instantly rising an octave into a sharp, theatrical panic. "How can you possibly say something so incredibly cold-hearted? After everything we've done to welcome you back tonight? Look around this table. Your family is standing here with open arms." "You didn't invite me here to welcome me back, Mom," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her manufactured panic. "You invited me here because the commercial bank called you on Thursday morning about a foreclosure proceeding on your property. You invited 16 people to an upscale restaurant to deliberately run up a $4,000 bill because you honestly believed that if you surrounded me with enough extended family, I would be too publicly embarrassed to say no to you." Brooke's face instantly drained of all its color, her eyes darting violently down toward her purse. How could you possibly know that?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "Because you left your phone on the bathroom vanity, Brooke," I replied, looking directly at her. "And your private dinner plan group chat was displaying your exact texts on maximum brightness. I read every single line. I read the part where you told Mom to order the most expensive items on the menu before I arrived so I couldn't send them back to the kitchen. I read the part where Dad said he would handle the financial ask once I was sufficiently lubricated with family guilt. And I read the part where Mom said I should be profoundly grateful for the immense privilege of paying for my own ambush." A horrific, dead silence instantly crashed down upon the entire alcove. Aunt Linda's jaw dropped entirely open. Uncle Greg suddenly looked deeply fascinated by his silverware. The cousins all froze mid-breath, realizing with absolute terror that the comfortable narrative of the evening had completely disintegrated. Right on cue, Nathan walked smoothly into the private alcove. He carried a small black leather presenter tray in his hand. He stepped up to the head of the table, bypassed my father entirely for a split second to place a tiny single slip of paper directly next to my sparkling water glass, and then turned fully toward my father, placing the large heavy master folio right down in front of his plate. "What the hell is this?" my father barked, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson as he stared down at the large leather folio. That is the master bill for the 16 guests who spent the last 2 hours consuming lobster towers and $400 bottles of Bordeaux, Dad, I explained, picking up my single slip of paper. And this piece of paper right here is my separate receipt. 1 single glass of sparkling water. $6.50. I pulled a crisp $10 bill from my pocket, placed it firmly down on top of my receipt and picked up my purse. Nathan, I said, looking up at the young waiter with a genuine smile. Keep the change. Thank you for the exceptional service tonight. Diana Raymond Mayfield, my father roared, slamming his heavy hand down onto the table so hard the crystal wine glasses rattled violently against the silver. You are not walking out of this restaurant. My credit card cannot handle a $4,000 charge right now. It will explicitly decline. Do you hear me? If you walk out that door, you are completely dead to this family. Permanently. I stood up from my chair, smoothing down the front of my gray blouse one final time. I looked down the entire length of the long table, staring at the 16 people who had spent the last 3 years treating me like an abandoned utility bill, only to pull me back into their lives the moment their own lights were about to be turned off. You already declared me dead to this family 3 years ago, Dad, I said, my voice echoing with an absolute, undeniable authority that left the entire room completely paralyzed. The only difference tonight is that I finally stopped trying to pay for the funeral. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. I turned my back on the alcove and walked out of the private dining room. I didn't run. I walked at a slow, measured, operational pace, my flat shoes clicking softly against the polished hardwood floors of the restaurant lobby. I pushed open the heavy tempered glass doors, stepped out into the cool, crisp Thursday evening air, and took the absolute deepest, most liberating breath of oxygen I had taken in 15 years. As I walked through the parking lot toward my car, I could hear the faint, distant sound of muffled shouting echoing from the front entrance of the restaurant, followed quickly by the sight of Aunt Linda and Uncle Greg hurriedly exiting the building with deeply panicked expressions on their faces. The great Mayfield illusion had completely shattered, and the reality of the bill had finally landed exactly where it belonged. I climbed into the driver's seat of my 9-year-old Honda Civic. I sat quietly in the dark cabin for a moment, my hands resting lightly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. My eyes drifted down to the center of the wheel, locking onto the small pink sticky note I had pressed there that morning. One dinner, then home. I reached out, gently peeled the sticky note off the leather and crumpled it into my palm. I started the engine, shifted the car into drive, and smoothly pulled out of the landscaped parking lot, leaving the flashing lights of the upscale shopping center completely behind me in the rearview mirror. The drive back to my side of town was entirely peaceful. I didn't turn on the radio and I didn't feel the need to call a friend to validate what I had just executed. For the first time in my entire adult life, the chaotic, twisting knot of anxiety that had lived inside my stomach since I was 15 years old had completely vanished. It had been replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of internal stillness. I realized then that Dr. Kwan had been entirely correct. My biggest mistake hadn't been saying no to my sister's bankrupt cafe 3 years ago. My biggest mistake had been spending my entire youth believing that I had to constantly underwrite the happiness of others just to earn a seat at their table. I had finally discovered that my personal dignity, my boundaries, and my self-worth were absolutely not open for commercial negotiation. They didn't possess a dollar amount, they couldn't be leveraged by family guilt, and they certainly couldn't be purchased for the price of a lobster dinner. I pulled into the quiet, dark parking lot of my modest condominium complex. I walked up the stairs, unlocked my front door and stepped into my clean, peaceful living room. It was a home that I had completely paid for with my own honest labor. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a large ice-cold glass of premium sparkling water, and sat down on the sofa in the beautiful, uninterrupted silence. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own life, I realized that I couldn't hear the distant echo of that old Dolly Parton song anymore. And for the first time in 3 years I didn't miss it at all.